The day Ted's life changed. Ted was an ordinary man. He lived in a small apartment in the city. Every morning he woke up early, drank his coffee, and went to work. His job was boring, but he needed money to pay his bills. One rainy morning, Ted left his home as usual. The streets were wet, and people walked fast with their umbrellas. He waited for the bus, thinking about his long day ahead. When the bus arrived, Ted got on and sat by the window. He looked outside at the busy streets. Everything seemed normal, but Ted felt different. He had a strange feeling, like something big was about to happen. As the bus moved, Ted closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about his life. Every day was the same. Wake up, work, sleep. He felt tired, not just in his body, but in his heart. Then, suddenly, the bus stopped. The driver shouted, and people gasped. Ted opened his eyes and looked outside. Something unexpected was happening. Ted looked out of the window. People on the street were pointing at something. He couldn't see clearly, so he stood up and moved closer. A man was standing in the middle of the road. He looked confused. Cars honked and drivers shouted at him, but he didn't move. Ted noticed that the man had no shoes. His clothes were old and torn. The bus driver sighed. "Another crazy man," he muttered. People on the bus laughed, but Ted didn't. Something about the man felt different. He wasn't just lost. He looked scared. Ted felt a strange pull in his heart. Without thinking, he stood up and walked to the front of the bus. The driver looked at him. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I'm going to help him," Ted said. Before the driver could stop him, Ted stepped off the bus and into the rain. The man looked at Ted with wide eyes. "Are you okay?" Ted asked. The man didn't answer. He just shook his head. Ted noticed his hands were shaking. He was cold. "Come with me," Ted said gently. He took off his jacket and put it over the man's shoulders. People on the street stared, but Ted didn't care. He knew this was the moment. This was the change he had been waiting for. The man looked at Ted, his eyes full of fear. He pulled the jacket around himself and whispered, "Thank you." His voice was weak, almost lost in the sound of the rain. Ted smiled. "Let's get out of the rain," he said. He gently took the man's arm and led him toward a small cafe nearby. People still stared, but Ted ignored them. Inside the cafe, the warm air touched their wet clothes. A waiter looked at them with curiosity but said nothing. Ted found a small table in the corner. "Sit here," he told the man. The man hesitated, then sat down slowly. He looked around, as if he hadn't been in a place like this for a long time. Ted waved at the waiter. "2 hot coffees, please." When the coffee arrived, the man wrapped his hands around the cup. He took a deep breath. The warmth seemed to calm him. Ted waited, giving him time. After a few minutes, the man finally spoke. "My name is Daniel," he said. His voice was rough, but there was a softness in it. Ted nodded. "I'm Ted," he replied. "Do you have a place to stay?" Daniel looked down. He shook his head. "No," he whispered. Ted took a deep breath. He knew what he had to do. This was not just a simple meeting. This was something bigger. Maybe this was the reason he got on that bus today. Maybe his life was about to change in a way he never expected. Ted looked at Daniel. He could see the pain in his eyes. Life had been hard for him. Ted thought for a moment. He could not just leave him here. "You can stay at my place tonight," Ted said. Daniel looked surprised. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Thank you," he whispered. They finished their coffee in silence. Then Ted paid the bill and stood up. Daniel followed him outside. The rain had stopped, but the air was still cold. They walked to Ted's small apartment. It was not big, but it was warm and safe. Ted opened the door. "Come in," he said. Daniel stepped inside carefully, as if he was afraid. Ted gave him a towel and some dry clothes. "You can take a shower if you want," he said. Daniel nodded and disappeared into the bathroom. Ted sat on the couch, thinking, why did he do this? He had never invited a stranger into his home before. But something told him this was the right thing to do. After a while, Daniel came out, looking much better. He smiled for the first time. "I feel human again," he said softly. Ted laughed. "Good," he replied. For the first time that day, everything felt right. But Ted had no idea that this was only the beginning. Ted made some tea and handed a cup to Daniel. They sat on the couch, sipping in silence. Ted could see that Daniel was still nervous. "You don't have to tell me anything," Ted said. "Just rest." Daniel nodded, but after a few moments he spoke. "I had a good life once," he said. "A job, a family, everything." He looked down at his hands. "But I lost it all. Bad choices, bad luck. One day I woke up and everything was gone." Ted listened quietly. He knew life could change in an instant. He had seen it happen before. Daniel sighed. "People walk past me every day. They don't see me, but you did." He looked at Ted with tired eyes. "Why?" Ted thought for a moment. "Because I know what it's like to feel lost," he said. "I was lost once too." Daniel didn't say anything, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel invisible. The night passed slowly. They talked about life, about mistakes, about hope. For the first time in years, Daniel felt like a person again. Ted didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing. This meeting had changed both of them forever. The sun rose slowly, filling the small apartment with warm light. Ted stretched and looked at Daniel, who was still asleep on the couch. He looked peaceful, as if for the first time in years he had found a place where he felt safe. Ted made breakfast, just some bread and tea. The smell woke Daniel up. He sat up and rubbed his eyes. "Good morning," Ted said, handing him a cup. Daniel took it with a small smile. "Thank you," he said softly. He looked around the room. "I can't remember the last time I woke up in a home." Ted sat down across from him. "You can stay here until you figure things out," he said. "No rush." Daniel hesitated. He wasn't used to kindness. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. Ted smiled. "Because someone once helped me," he said. "I was lost, just like you. A stranger gave me a second chance. Now I'm doing the same." Daniel looked down at his tea. His hands trembled slightly. Maybe I can start again." His voice was quiet, but there was hope in it. Ted nodded. Yes, you can. Outside, the city was waking up. People hurried to work, buses rumbled down the streets, and life continued. But inside that small apartment, something had changed. For the first time in years, Daniel wasn't alone. And for the first time in a long while, Ted felt like he had made a difference.